Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
I'm Dennis Kratz, the director of the UT Dallas Center for Asian Studies, and I'm pleased to welcome you. This evening's lecture, Orwell Between East and West, is presented by the Center and reflects our commitment to sponsor substantial explorations of timely and significant topics. I doubt anyone could readily name a work of 20th century literature that remains more timely or as philosophically urgent and, well, more terrifying than George Orwell's 1984. Nor can I imagine a more learned scholar, more perceptive literary critic, or thoughtful human being than Dr. Andrew Rubin to examine Orwell's continuing international relevance. For the past several years, Dr. Rubin and I have been working on a project to bring the enduring value and importance of humanities education to a larger community of adult learners. Our own intended small contribution toward creating a less, if you will, Orwellian world. Please welcome to your computer screens and your minds my colleague and friend, Dr. Andrew Rubin.
Thank you, Dennis, for that very kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, even virtually. And talking about Orwell makes me feel a bit like a deadline professor because he's always since we came up with the title of this talk, Orwell Between East and West. Obviously, things have changed given the use of in recent weeks of the word Orwellian. So I'd just like to share my screen with you.
As Andrew's preparing the screen, I'll remind folks, if you want to ask a question, please write your question and send it to me on the chat through Microsoft Teams. Go, Andrew.
Right. Okay, thank you. So Orwell's 1984 has served as an optic through which millions of readers have peered as a way to imagine the struggle of a solitary individual who resists the power and authority of an omniscient, omnipotent, and omnivigilant state. Since its publication in 1949, it has shown a remarkable ability to transcend its native context, raising vital questions about the role that the literary imagination has played and continues to play in our political life. It did not take long for Orwell, who died in January 1950 at the age of 46 of tuberculosis, less than a year after the book was published, to realize that 1984, as he wrote of Charles Dickens' work, quote, entered the mind of those who do not care about books, end quote. Orwell's 1984 has been reduced largely, in many ways, to political slogans. Orwellian, Big Brother, Thought Police, Newspeak have become part of our collective vocabulary. An inventory of it is a kind of political barometer of our political unconscious, and it is a measure of the degree to which politicians and public writers are, in a way, under the grip of the orthodoxies of thought. I doubt that I need not tell you that the decision by Twitter to suspend the account of the former or ex-president, I should say, led his son to decry the act by a private company as Orwellian. Exactly 4 years ago, shortly after Trump was sworn in, his press secretary had claimed that, quote, the inauguration had been the most well-attended ever, period, even though it was obvious to the naked eye that it was not. I'm sorry. Several days later, the president's advisor, Kellyanne Conway, told Meet the Press Chuck Todd that Spicer was merely providing the press with alternative facts. The book ascended to #1 on the bestseller list. Conway's ability to transform serious books, even dystopian classics like 1984, days later in the bestsellers, led one critic to describe her as, quote, the Oprah Winfrey of the Oval Office. It was the anchorman Dan Rather who was the first to describe that expression as a George Orwell phrase. And several days later, the executive editor of the New York Times had invoked Orwell yet again, describing alternative facts as an example of Newspeak. In 2013, I recall with some alarm the numerous calls I suddenly received asking how bad Orwellian really was, after Edward Snowden described the National Security Agency's surveillance program as worse than Orwellian. Apparently, I had less imagination than a federal circuit judge, who in a ruling on the legality of the National Security Agency's surveillance of phone records, had described the NSA's program as almost Orwellian. The columnist Nicholas Kristof tweeted in a jest that the government should pay royalties to the Orwell estate. There's a very long history of the uses to which 1984 has been put, and I will have no time to talk about that today. I'll briefly summarize some of the more important moments. Shortly after its publication, Orwell's novel was adapted for television, and on December 12, 1954, slogans such as Big Brother were introduced for the first time into the public mind. The BBC's 2-hour teleplay, starring Peter Cushing and Yvonne Mitchell, had stirred up an enormous controversy, one that was at the time compared to H.G. Wells's hoax in 1938 around the War of the Worlds. Though the BBC had warned its audience that its adaptation would not be, quote, light entertainment, and, quote, would be unsuitable to children and those with weak nerves, end quote, viewers decried the show as ghastly. The scenes of Winston Smith's torture led some to urge the BBC to set standards, lest depictions of violence spawn an outbreak of crime. And one must not forget the countdown to 1984, when there was a spirited debate as to whether Orwell's prophecy had been realized, either in the Soviet Union or the United States, without much discussion as to how such a debate could be safely conducted if Orwell's fiction had actually been realized. That same year, further confirming how a book could be placed in the service of a consumer society and become a commodity fetish, Apple Computer kicked off its promotion of the Macintosh by using an advertisement based on 1984 and directed by the filmmaker Ridley Scott, the director of films like Alien and Blade Runner. In the 60-second spot that had aired during the 1984 Super Bowl, the commercial was really directed at IBM, International Business Machines, which the commercial stops just short of labeling as Big Brother. The commercial's climax is stunning. There's an image of marching zombie-like citizens who are marching to Big Brother saying, "We are one people with one cause, one will." And that image of Big Brother is then shattered by a woman dressed as if she were in the Olympic, who hurls a hammer through the screen in a gesture of David confronting Goliath, or using the hammer from the Soviet hammer and sickle flag. The identification of IBM with Big Brother was a deliberate and symbolic reversal, since IBM, International Business Machines, is the embodiment at the time of capitalism. By equating IBM with Stalinism, Apple, in a twist, represents itself as capitalism and democracy. The commercial rests on the classic role that the book had served during the Cold War, where the book was in a variety of ways placed into the service of anti-communism. Architects of the Cold War, such as George Kennan, had claimed that Orwell's vision of totalitarianism in 1984 was somehow more real than the reality he had known as the US ambassador to Moscow. Quote, "The fictional and symbolic images created by Orwell," Kennan wrote, "represents totalitarianism more adequately than the Soviet picture as I have known them in the flesh." While there is a great deal that the book has that has historically resonated with contemporary politics. Newspeak phrases such as alternative facts, the doublethink and amnesia that so easily allows official allies to almost overnight become enemies, to say nothing of Orwell's insight into how prefabricated phrases make the rather sordid process of military conflict acceptable. There has been, with very few exceptions, I think, a reluctance to interpret the book as a work of literature. The critic Irving Howe, for example, claimed that 1984 could not be, quote, understood, nor could it properly be valued simply by resorting to the usual literary categories. The book must be approached through politics, he said. Wyndham Lewis described it as a first-rate political document. This tendency to read the book through non-literary categories raises crucial questions about how the political appropriation of 1984 as a way to understand the present might actually, I want to argue, impede or needlessly obfuscate our apprehension of the present. To begin with, these political readings slight Orwell's long-standing interest in the question. Oops. Let me repeat that. To begin with, these political readings slight Orwell's long-standing interest in the question of the linguistic decadence of English. The decline of the English language was often the subject of his As I Please columns that he wrote for the Tribune. The subject was, of course, central to his imagination of Newspeak in 1984. And as we can see here from his literary notebooks, notebooks that he compiled before composing 1984. These literary notebooks were written in 1945. The book was originally to be titled The Last Man of Europe. It's interesting to ponder what would have become of it had it been titled that. But so much like Jonathan Swift, Orwell kept a long list, an extensive list of dead and dying metaphors, meaningless and hackneyed phrases. Here's another page from the same notebook. George Orwell's essay, Politics and the English Language, is a classic statement on how the abuse of the English language has contributed to the impoverishment and narrowing of critical thought. The predominance of a particular style and structure of political thought fosters the spread of prefabricated phrases that distort, conceal, and obfuscate reality because of their imprecision. Modern writing no longer consists in choosing words for their exact meaning and inventing image to make the meaning clear, but rather recycling phrases that take the place of thought. Instead of carefully choosing words or ready-made phrases, he argues, choose you. If you use ready-made phrases, you do not have to hunt about for words. They will construct your sentences for you, even think your thoughts for you, and they will perform the important service of concealing your meaning even from yourself. The cultural reflex to use the word Orwellian is little more than a kind of noise, I think, that Orwell would say would be uttered in unconsciousness. In a quote from the same essay, he says, "When one watches some tired hack on the platform mechanically repeating familiar phrases like bestial atrocities, iron heel, blood-stained tyranny, free people of the world, standing shoulder to shoulder, one often has a curious feeling that one is not watching a live human being, but some kind of dummy. A feeling which suddenly becomes stronger at moments when the light catches the speaker's spectacles and turns them into blank discs which seem to have no eyes behind them. A speaker who uses this kind of phraseology has gone some distance towards turning himself into a machine. The appropriate noises are coming out of his larynx, but his brain is not involved as it would be if he were choosing his words for himself. If the speech he is making is one that he is accustomed to make over and over again, he may be almost unconscious of what he is saying. And this reduced state of consciousness, if not indispensable, is at rate favorable to political conformity," end quote. Rhetorical devices and conventions like dying metaphors, false limbs, and pretentious diction, meaningless words are, according to Orwell, essentially instruments of this kind of unconscious speech. Dying metaphors are phrases that have lost their evocative power, yet continue to circulate within the English language because they spare the writer the trouble of inventing phrases for themselves. Phrases such as give rise to, take effect, give grounds for, play a leading role in, conceal or distort one's intended meaning. Prefabricated phrases like with respect to, the fact that, in view of, pass off opinion as fact. Pretentious diction, words such as phenomenon, element, individual, objective, are words that give the impression of impartiality to what are in fact skewed judgments. Adjectives like historic, unforgettable, veritable, groundbreaking are routinely uttered to refer to events that are hardly historic, unforgettable, or inevitable. But of all the infelicitous habits that Orwell describes, none is perhaps more significant than his description of empty rhetoric or meaningless words, words such as democracy, socialism, freedom, patriotism, justice, which all share the confounding complexity of possessing several different meanings that cannot be reconciled with each other. Ideology, in other words, has hijacked, he says, or infiltrated language. It is inherent in the ready-made phrases we use to understand and make sense of our contemporary world. The concealment and distortion of reality is guaranteed, he would say, in advance by a rhetoric that favors euphemisms, that package and control discussion, despite the appearance of variety and diversity. Events like the military invasion and subsequent occupation of Iraq, the invasion of Afghanistan, or the U.S.'s detention of enemy combatants held without habeas corpus or due process in Guantanamo and Bagram, are actions that can only be defended by a rhetoric and discourse that camouflages a cruel reality. Otherwise, who with any conscience could defend airstrikes on defenseless civilians? Who possesses the malice to justify the mass displacement of civilians from their homes by the millions? And who could defend the use of, quote, enhanced interrogation techniques that are a clear violation of the conventions against torture? Instead, a rhetoric prevails that claims that cities are neutralized or pacified. The murder of innocent human beings and civilians is described with callous and cruel phrases like collateral damage. Similar distortions of language abounded shortly after the pandemic of COVID began to kill what is now more than 400,000 people, a number that has exceeded those that have been killed and fought in the Second World War. The virus SARS-CoV-2, which produces the symptoms that the WHO named COVID-19, was by many, routinely described as the China virus, the Wuhan flu, the Wuhan pneumonia, in order to imply that the virus somehow had a national identity. Describing the virus as Chinese only amplified the xenophobia that Trump had already inflamed along the southern border. In such a way, this new resurgence of an epidemic and the strengthening of barriers in the fight against illegal information was achieved by giving a virus which has no papers, no passport, and national identity. In similar ways, words such as totalitarianism, Islam, and I would go so far as to even say East and West, are abstract generalizations. They're epistemic deformations that possess their own vocabularies, styles of thought that flatten out variety, diversity, multiplicity. To interpret Orwell between, quote, East and West is to see how it is well worth questioning whether there exist geographical spaces whose inhabitants can be defined on the basis of religion, culture, or some essence proper to that geographical space. Indeed, it is not insignificant that Orwell's conception of the standardization of thought, ideology, and language appears to have first been articulated in a story in a story that he recounts in an experience he had in Burma, where he, then known as Eric Blair, he had changed his name to George Orwell several years later, had served as an imperial policeman for several years from 1922 to 1927. This story, Shooting an Elephant, which is the first time Orwell uses the metaphors for Newspeak of the hollow posing dummy, appears in the short story Shooting an Elephant, and he writes, "As I stood there with a rifle in my hands, I first grasped the futility of the white man's dominion in the East. Here was I, the white man, with his gun, standing in front of an unarmed native crowd, seemingly the leading actor of the piece. But in reality, I was only an absurd puppet. I perceived at this moment that when man turns tyrant, it is his own freedom he destroys. He becomes a sort of hollow, posing dummy, the conventionalized figure of a Sahib." Now, if you look back to the here on the right, Politics English Language, from the other quote I read, you can see that that same image appears. So what am I saying here? What I'm saying is that Orwell's experience of colonialism as a colonial officer, it gave him a very, very clear sense of what it was like, of a colonial ideology. And then what then later happens, 10 years later, 12 years later, when he writes Politics of the English Language, he takes that understanding of colonial ideology and transposes it upon the English language. So just as if though this unarmed native crowd and shooting the elephant turned him into a kind of leading actor of the piece, made him into an absurd puppet pushed to and fro, one sees in Politics in the English Language a similar kind of gesture, but one that is no longer based upon the colonial subjects, but upon the English language itself. On the bottom right-hand side, you see ready-made phrases. They will construct your sentences for you, even think your thoughts for you, and at a certain point will even perform important services of concealing meaning even from yourself. It is at this point that the relationship of politics and languages become clear. So what I'm suggesting is there's a very interesting connection between Orwell's experience in Burma, where he lived and worked as an imperial policeman from 1922 to 27, really gives him a sense of how colonial ideology that he then takes and transforms into a certain kind of understanding of the politics of the English language and eventually Newspeak, which he articulates in 1984. In 1984, Newspeak is the language that is devised not to expand, but rather to diminish the range of thought. It aims to eliminate from English all words through which one could meaningfully express Enlightenment principles such as freedom, justice, democracy, equality, truth, reasons, ethics, judgment, beauty, one could go on, health, so on. All of which Newspeak is intent on purging from its vocabulary to effectively stifle dissent by destroying the very vocabulary in which one could articulate a critique of the oppressive structures in Oceania. Dissent, or as it is called in Newspeak, thought crime, will be literally impossible because there will be no words in which to express one's objection. The goal of Newspeak in this respect is the elimination of thought. Quote, "There will be no thought as we understand it now," Syme, who's the philologist who is editing the 11th edition of Newspeak, the dictionary, explains to our protagonist Winston. This ensures the complete homogenization of thought. As Syme goes on, orthodoxy means not thinking, not needing to think. Orthodoxy is unconsciousness, end quote. Shortly after Syme makes this observation, we are presented with essentially the same image we encounter in shooting an elephant in Politics of the English Language. As Winston, quote, "As Winston watched the eyeless face with the jaw moving rapidly up and down, he had the curious feeling that it was not a real human being, but some kind of dummy. It was not the man's brain that was speaking. It was his larynx. The stuff that was coming out of him consisted of words, but it was not speech in the true sense," end quote. The issue of Newspeak raises an interesting problem, one that all dystopias faced. How is it possible, I wonder, to even narrate a story in a world of total domination? How do we deal with the paradox that the narrator of the story is permitted to narrate the story at all without suffering the same fate as Winston Smith? Novels, we know, require narration, and yet it is presumably, in 1984, no longer possible to tell a story. What do we make of this paradox? A paradox that is embodied in the rather strange supplement that is supplied to us after the novel ends, an appendix, the general principles of Newspeak. What kind of novel, what is odd? What kind of novel has an appendix? This odd form might, after all, help us to better understand how and why the narrator is not subject to the forms of surveillance, control, and intimidation that would have, in any other circumstance, made the novel impossible to narrate. This paradox, this tension, is a feature of the novel that we would scarcely notice if we were to have followed the advice of the critic Irving Howe and read this book without resorting to, quote, "the usual literary categories," end quote. If we fail to understand this literary aspect of the novel, I fear that we have failed Orwell as a writer of English who took his prose style and the state of the English language very seriously. Careful readers of the appendix will discover that the principles of Newspeak is much more than an elaboration of grammar. It is, in a way, a kind of history. I say kind of history because it is not often that history is written in the subjunctive mood, as this appendix is. Regret and reflections on the sources of political failure might demand the subjunctive mood, but histories are rarely written with that kind of conditionality. So when we learn from whomever is narrating the appendix that it was, quote, expected that Newspeak would have superseded Old Speak, or Standard English, as we should call it, by 2050, end quote, we are informed of this conditionally. It, quote, would have finally superseded Old Speak if, end quote. If what? Newspeak, it seems, has neither failed nor has succeeded, according to the appendix. According to the account in the appendix, the entire project of Newspeak was on course to bring Standard English to an end, which would have meant that the totalitarian project, the absolute and complete control of the totality of society, would have been achieved because there no longer would have been a language in which one could articulate the novel or even the appendix itself. We learned from the appendix that the A vocabulary of Newspeak had become complete. Those are the words that one needed to conduct the business of everyday life. And those had been rendered staccato. There were staccato sounds expressing oneself a clearly understood concept, making it quite impossible to use the A vocabulary for literary purposes or for political or philosophical discussion. So too had the B vocabulary had been finished off. The B vocabulary were words of political significance. They were euphemisms that were shortened so that they could be uttered rapidly and, quote, rouse the minimum of echoes in the speaker's mind. Speech, in this sense, was divorced divorced and made independent of consciousness. But what the philologists and editors of Newspeak had not yet worked out, according to the appendix, was how to deal with the translation of literature, British literature in particular. The works of Chaucer, Shakespeare, Milton, Dickens, and maybe we should add to that Orwell, had not been translated or could not be translated into Newspeak. Literature, as one might imagine, poses a significant problem to the editors of the next edition of Newspeak. It is in this context of the claims of the appendix, we should ask ourselves, then how do we interpret the prose of 1984? Readers of 1984 will recall the instruments of writing and reading that Winston procures. His diary, he procures a diary, he procures a glass paperweight. All of these are antiques of an earlier time. They sustain and objectify the very idea that there remains a solid, concrete, and particular human history of experience that can still be written about, so long as there is a language which exists, in which human relationships and their relationships to the world can be conveyed. Winston is absolutely fascinated with this paperweight, even though it is not particularly beautiful. He says it belongs to an age quite different from the present one. What makes it doubly attractive, he says, is its useless. The paperweight itself, I think, refers to a kind of writing. And here's the quote on the right. Winston turned over toward the light and lay gazing into the glass paperweight. The inexhaustibly interesting thing was not the fragment of coral, but the interior of the glass itself. There was such a depth of it, and yet was almost as transparent as air. It was as though the surface of the glass had been the arch of the sky, enclosing a tiny world with its atmosphere complete. He had the feeling that he could get inside of it, and that in fact he was inside of it, along with the mahogany bed and the gate-leg table and the clock and the steel engraving and the paperweight itself. The paperweight was the room he was in, and the coral was Julia's life and his own, fixed in a sort of eternity at the heart of the crystal. Few passages, I think, embody Orwell's aesthetic principle, as well as his principle of objectivity that shapes his prose. In an essay he wrote several years before he wrote 1984, It's called Why I Write. He observes, with the echoes of this passage, quote, "So long as I remain alive, I shall continue to feel strongly about prose style, to love the surface of the earth, and to take pleasure in solid objects and scraps of useless information." To emphasize the interior of this glass paperweight instead of the coral, to describe its interior space as having a depth and transparency to it, for the contour of the glass to reflect the arch of the sky, and for it to contain within it the surface of the earth, and along with it objects that include the clock, the passing of time, the bed in which he may dream, and the steel engraving, Winston's life, his love for his partner Julia, and her life as well. And even more than this, the paperweight contains not only himself, but the paperweight itself, reflecting itself infinity and forever into an eternity. The lasting conflict for Orwell, the overwhelming conflict he faced as a writer, was how to sustain a commitment to good prose in the English language on the one hand, and to politics on the other, without being pulled too far in either direction, without writing for the sake of words on the one hand, or writing with only a political concern on the other. In this respect, we are given the framework to read 1984 from a perspective we are given that comes after the novel. And in this, I invite you to consider the kind of prose that Orwell is suggesting resists the aim of Newspeak, that divorces speech from consciousness. Is it the kind of writing that makes Newspeak's aim to, quote, make speech independent of consciousness impossible? I believe that it approximates the kind of writing that sustains human relationships, that makes it dialogic, that embodies a language that gives us access to ourselves, to our paradoxical plurality that we try to make accessible to others, in spite of the inadequacy of words to do so, as Hannah Arendt says. Orwell seems to be affirming, with a certain ambiguity, the ability to express individual experience in literary form, while raising questions at the same time about the threats that exist to literature and language. He wants, in other words, to demonstrate that literature teaches us something about what words do to us, and how we, in turn, might try to do something to them that will perhaps modify the order of things on which they depend for their meaning. As the critic Richard Poirier has observed, to literature is left the distinction that it invites the reader into a dialectic relationship to words with an intensity allowable nowhere else, end quote. So when we have lost the ability to give expression to individual human experience, when we no longer have the words or the forms through which the expression of the human experience can be articulated fully and can establish the grounds for understanding the shared and overlapping experience with others, when our discourse has been hijacked by prefabricated and reified phrases like Orwellian that do not require thought, when, as it seems to be the case, reality has outstripped human experience, when discourse is saturated with expressions that take place in the absence of critical activity, when ready-made phrases sustain the prevailing illusion and conventions of thought that have lulled our culture into a state of quiescence, when, in other words, we fail to pay attention to the paperweight, to the weight of literature and the language which it describes, when we think of 1984 as a collection of political slogans like I have on the left there, Orwellian, Big Brother's watching you, thought police, we see how the prevalence of the use of the term Orwellian is yet another way we have actually come closer to allowing forms of rhetoric to usurp human consciousness and stifle our intellectual ability to engage in critical activity and, for that matter, democratic critique, at enormous cost from which, if it continues, we will be certainly less able to recover. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, Ivan, this is that. Andrew, that is provocative in the extreme. Is there anyone in the lovely attending audience of who would like to ask a question? Actually, I have one that was sent in, Andrew, and um, the, the question is, are you suggesting then that 1984 has no political value if you're emphasizing how seldom it's been read as literature? What is the space that Orwell occupies between a literary work and a political work?
Well, I would say that they're not mutually exclusive. That the literary reading, as I obviously am saying, is deeply political. Is deeply political, and it shows us how in which we're engaging, how to engage the political world, not through these slogans, not through Big Brother is watching you or this is Orwellian, but through paying attention to the role that language plays. Orwell was constantly working through this tension of how do I write? Do I write for language itself, or do I write with a pure political purpose? And this is one of the reasons I think he writes this work of fiction. He's a journalist, is to demonstrate precisely that paradox, that tension, and to show, and that's why I think the appendix, which one would really read as literary, but rather just as some sort of handbook, an afterthought. And some students I've taught things, well, maybe the publisher added that appendix. No. And no, it's there for very interesting. What kind of novel has an appendix? I mean, you know, that's very interesting. And then how do we read that in relationship to the way that Orwell is writing and how Orwell is writing? And I think that is both a literary and political reading in that respect.
Okay. Let me while you ponder that, an inevitable question from a political scientist. I see Dr. Ted Harpham, who's the dean of the Wildenthal Honors College at UT Dallas, has a question. Ted?
Hi, fascinating, Andrew, your presentation.
Thank you.
I'm curious though, when I read the appendix, I think of who's the author of the appendix, and all I can think of is it's the party. And if that's true, then the whole attack on language in Newspeak is the party, and it's a political attack. So I read this very political. It's funny because I read the book on Rittenberg that was published a number of years ago. He's the fellow who stayed behind in China when Mao took over. And to read his biography is like reading Winston's biography in 1984. So I'm just curious. I see the attack on language here, and I think, in a sense, Orwell's defense of language and the proper use of language with this. I'm not sure we're opposed, but you didn't mention the party once, and I think that's fascinating. In your
right. Yes, I mean, Winston is an outer party member. He's a writer, right? He's rewriting history for the Ministry of Truth. I mean, it's the same question one can ask about the appendix of who's narrating the story, right? And it's certainly not the party. You know, there would be very, you know, the way in which the perspective one has, the narrator's perspective one has, is really focalized, is external, and is focused through Winston. But once Winston loves Big Brother, the party, the idea that the appendix would be written by the party seems to be, I would question that because of the way in which the subjunctive mood is being used. It would have been possible. It would have been possible to do this. I mean, would the party admit? Would the party admit to its own inability? That's an interesting question. I mean, I never thought of that though. I'd always seen it as the same, you know, the same narrator in some way.
I'm fascinated, Andrew, because when I read this last month, I was struck by, it isn't the story of a totalitarian society, it's a story of a totalitarian party and the movement from the outer ends of the party to the inside and what happens. That might be wrong, or maybe it's the world I'm living in right now, but it's not how I read it when I was 15.
Right.
anyway, I'm a political scientist, so I don't read things in that literary perspective. I really enjoyed your talk.
Well, there's a fascinating story from that perspective. That there's the Polish writer Czesław Miłosz, when he was in the Polish Communist Party, when he wasn't known as the Polish Poet Laureate, said he came upon a book that had represented the Soviet Union better than anyone ever could imagine. So what you have here is, this is 2 years before he became a Poet Laureate. Here you have a Polish bureaucrat finding a book that represents this resistance, just like there's this Goldstein book. And Miłosz is saying this book is better than, this book explains the Soviet Union better than anything I could have ever imagined. Which is this eerie, uncanny connection between what Orwell narrates about Goldstein's book on oligarchy. There's a book that the inner party has, just like Miłosz has this book. It's sort of, it was something that was quite interesting as a political.
Okay. I have a hand up that I believe is Carolyn Kim, who will come second, but I have a question. We have a question, an interesting question typed in, which is, how does the evolving role of language used in social media, I wonder if the writer of the question left the D off devolving, does the evolving role of language used in social media impact the principle of Newspeak?
Well, I mean, I think one can say that, like, Twitter is, one can only write a certain amount, 135 characters, and it reduces the capacity to think, the capacity to make arguments. That the social media, the forms that are available to us, are no longer, it's interesting. All the forms of writing in 1984 are written by hand, right? That Winston wants to write in a diary. He doesn't want to use the telescreen. There's certainly a role that these new forms of media do play in limiting, I think, the range of thought, the range of expression, because the forums themselves are limiting in a certain way. So I think social media, while it might allow for expression, also at the same time does limit and deform language in ways that I think I see in the classroom, and that is a struggle. We no longer read books. Books are read on a screen. They're light now. You don't turn a page, you scroll. So there's.
Okay.
That's an interesting question. That's my opinion.
I have Carolyn Kim, my colleague from the Crow Museum. Hi, Carolyn. Unmute and have a comment or a question.
Thank you. This was so fascinating and so timely. Thank you so much for
it's a pleasure.
Offering this to us. And following Dean Harpham's comments about coming at this 1984 from a political science angle, and I can only come at it from my, million years ago, from just the studying it, as an English lit subject. And I'm thinking about how, I understand that Brave New World and Aldous Huxley was an influence on Orwell and this writing. And I'm thinking about those two novels and how you think that they should be studied now for current, generations of middle schoolers and high schoolers and beyond, and how the teachings might be changed.
Well, I think it should be taught, alongside his essays on language, his essays on politics and English language, as I said, in order to get a sense in which he is so invested in that. And there's another essay in which he writes called "Why I Write," and that's where he really tries to work through. He says in any other age, he would have written a different way, and realize he's writing in the middle of fascism. He's writing in the middle of, the Moscow trials. He's right in the middle of this, and that he was involved in the Spanish Civil War, and that experience in the Spanish Civil War, which I didn't have a chance to talk about, was absolutely decisive for him, because he found himself in Barcelona at a particular time when he saw that there were lies that were being told, victories that weren't even victories taking place, soldiers fighting that weren't even fighting, and these lies had then been reproduced when he went back to London, and he couldn't even get his eyewitness account published in publications like the New Statesman and so on. And that experience was fundamental to really the way it shaped his understanding of Stalinism. He never became, he was an anti-Stalinist, but he never became kind of disillusioned like many of the others had. He remained throughout his life, as he said, every line, which is an interesting expression, every line I've ever written has been as a democratic socialist. I mean, every line, you know, you can see how he's interested in questions of form. So yeah, the 1984 is complex in that way because it's so involved and implicated in its own embedded in its own history, in that history of the 30s, which he came out of, and the debates over language that he was involved in, and I think that's an important. I think that's the way I emphasize when I teach that book. You know, rather than trying to use it to explain the present, because we lose a lot if we use it to explain the present. I think it actually prevents us. It incapacitates us in a way. You don't know, for example, you don't look at the really, really denigrating view of the working class that are described as animals, you know, in the book. Even though the hope lies in the proles, one doesn't, you know, there's limitations to using that work as a way to understand the present. Yes, if it shows you how bad totalitarianism is good, I mean, that's all fine. You know, if it's giving you a sense, well, that's not what we want here. But if it's used, the book is used anytime any government restriction is in place, like take my hands off of Medicare, you know, that kind of thing. You know, Orwellian is invoked in any way like that. I think it does a great disservice to the novel. But you know, I do think as a representation of totalitarianism, it is a quite persuasive one. It's interesting to read. When I've taught it, I've read it alongside works such as Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism, which she actually hadn't read 1984, which is quite interesting. But there's a lot of different ways to teach it, and the book that actually Orwell did use to write 1984 was a book called Zemyatin's We. It was Russian. It was a Russian book. I can't pronounce his name. Dennis, do you know how to pronounce it? Zemyatin. You're muted, Dennis.
Evgeny Zamyatin.
Thank you. I knew. Evgeny Zamyatin. Yes, we.
It's a great book, by the way. Have you read? We is almost as frightening as 1984.
Yeah. And that was the book he read. It wasn't so much Huxley and that. The books he read was that, as well as some other books I'm trying to remember right now. James Burnham on the Managerial Revolution, which is something he read at the time that really informs the way he views the government of 1984.
Andrew, let me come in here because you've mentioned Russia. Eric Fromm's afterword to the 1984 edition is, books like Orwell's are powerful warnings, and it would be most unfortunate if the reader smugly interpreted 1984 as another indictment of Stalinist barbarism, and if he does not see that it means us too.
Right.
I'd like to ask you to opine a bit about one. You've started the attempt to control and delimit language here,
Right.
and also since it's Orwell between East and West, I want to bring up a story that I read recently. There's a major flourishing, as some know, of science fiction literature in China today. And one of the most interesting Chinese science fiction stories I've read in the past 5 years is very much based on 1984. It imagines a China where the internet is completely controlled and there's a long list of words you can't use.
Right. Yes.
And the Winston Smith of this story is part of a rabble of rebels who have found circumlocutions and euphemisms to talk about the forbidden.
Right.
And as in 1984, they are caught and captured and reprogrammed. And they returned to the solution that the government has found to stop people from using words they aren't allowed to use. And instead, he finds a list of the 180 words you can use. And what do you see as, is this a universal problem right now, the delimiting of thought through the delimiting of value? What about the East? Originally it was about Russia, we thought, but now when I hear Orwellian, I hear mostly comments about China.
Right. I'm going to come at this in a really roundabout way, but I will get to China. At the time Orwell was writing, shortly before he was writing, in the 1920s, there was a great effort to develop an international language, Esperanto, Volapük, and so on, a language that everyone could understand. One of the languages was it was an auxiliary language that was developed at Cambridge by the mathematician C.K. Ogden and the critic I.A. Richards, who would then go on to China. And it was called BASIC, British American Standard International Commercial English. It was a form of English that consisted of 800 words. And it was an auxiliary language. It didn't replace English. It was a language that you could use in addition to English, so one could continue to trade after the end of the British Empire. Well, I.A. Richards after coming here, he then went to China to use basic English, to use basic English as a way to teach English in China. Now, the question of finding a language in which one can write without in a way that eludes, I think I find it much more interesting to think about poetry, and that kind of writing. And poets, in some sense, are the most dangerous because they represent language, the expressions of the individual subject, himself or herself, and that it's the repression of poetry in China. It was the repression of poetry in Syria, repression of poetry in Cuba, that more than anything else, has to do with the way of controlling poetics and language. And that, I think that gets into, and certainly there have been, I don't speak Chinese, I don't know enough about Chinese, but I do know that there's been one of the most oppressive aspects of the Chinese government has been its tendency to imprison poets. And poetry is a way of, poetry is a way of writing about power and finding different words and different ways of expressing oneself. But I'm not sure if that's answering your question or not. I doubt that. So. Your mic is off, Dennis.
I just find Andrew so fascinating. I want to have conversations with him.
That's what we do all the
time. But this is almost an ad for the humanities, because it seems part of Newspeak is to delimit what you can say and what you can think, because words are limited in their meaning. And isn't the role of poetry and the humanities to expand the possible implications of words so we can't take them or the ideas they represent for granted.
Right, right. You know, exactly that literature, the study of literature, the study of languages teaches something. This is what I said earlier about what language does to us and what we in turn can do with words to change the possible order of things. And that's why literature of all the arts, I think, is the most garrulous of them. And it's something we all share, unlike painting, like music. In that sense, it is something that's shared, that's dialogic, that one expresses to the other, to understand, to communicate with the other.
Yeah. There's a request, by the way, before we go away, if, Andrew, if you could type in some of the titles of some of the books that you referenced. And I'm proud to say that's from one of my students who's here. So,
I will.
any other questions from those in attendance?
Well, I guess we've answered all the questions then.
Yes. Okay. Well, Andrew, thank you for, there have been some comments sent about what a provocative and thoughtful lecture and hour this has been.
It was a pleasure, and I've never lectured like this before in front of a camera, and it's been a pleasure. And thank you for giving me this opportunity. And it's been, like I said, part of this endeavor that we've been working on to find ways to.
For a while. And I will take this opportunity to plug two lectures. Next Wednesday, the 27th at 7 p.m., the Center for Asian Studies presents, in collaboration with the School of Arts and Humanities and the Dallas Museum of Art, Arts and Letters Live program, a conversation with Charles Yu, whose novel Interior Chinatown received the National Book Award for Fiction for 2020. It's a remarkable book, and he's a remarkable writer. I urge you to join us and to show the breadth of culture we address on the 20th, Saturday the 20th at 4 p.m. The Center for Asian Studies presents a lecture by Professor Michelle Cho from the University of Toronto on K-pop and Black Lives Matter activism.
Dr. Kratz, it's on the 30th.
It's on the 30th. I'm sorry, did I give the wrong date? My mind reminds me it's January 30th?
Yes.
Saturday, January 30th at 4 p.m. I like to make a mistake every 5 minutes or so. Thank you all for your attendance, for your comments, and Andrew, thank you for what you're doing on behalf of Old Speak and Humanities Speak and Human Speak.
Thank
We
you.
look forward to seeing many of you in the future. Thank you for joining us. Have a good evening.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for taking the time to be here. Pleasure.